2:17 p.m., July 7, 1943. Kursk, Soviet Union. Soviet tank commander Major Pavel Rotmistrov peered through his binoculars at the dust cloud on the horizon. 50 T-34 tanks from his unit were rumbling towards a lone German Tiger tank. It stood motionless in a depression. Its tracks were damaged. It couldn't escape. Rotmistrov smiled, an easy target. 3 hours later, Rotmistrov would be silent. The Tiger still stood. 22 of his T-34s burned as smoking wrecks on the battlefield. The rest had retreated. In panic, the man inside that Tiger was Franz Staudegger, and what he did that day would earn him the first Knight's Cross ever awarded to a Tiger commander. Before we continue, if you appreciate stories like this, subscribe now. It costs nothing and helps immensely. Now, back to the story. The story of Staudegger's impossible victory begins a day earlier, July 6, 1943. Operation Citadel had just begun, Germany's last major offensive on the Eastern Front. 6,000 tanks would clash in the coming weeks. 2 million soldiers, the largest tank battle in history. The Soviets had known for months that the attack was coming. Their spies in Switzerland, the Lucy spy ring, had betrayed the German plans. Stalin knew the exact date, the precise attack sectors, the accurate troop strengths. He ordered the positions to be fortified. 8 concentric defensive lines were built around Kursk. 400,000 mines were laid. 3,000 miles of trenches were dug. It was the best prepared defense in history. The German army ran headfirst into the trap. The German generals knew that the Soviets were prepared, but Hitler insisted on the attack. He needed a victory to boost morale. He needed the Tiger to prove that German technology could overcome anything. The Tiger I was indeed a technical marvel. 57 tons of fighting weight, powered by a Maybach HL-230 engine with 700 horsepower. Its top speed was 24 miles per hour on the road, but barely 12 off-road. Fuel consumption was enormous, 142 gallons per 62 miles off-road, a logistical nightmare. But the firepower made up for everything. The 88mm KWK-36 L-56 gun had originally been developed as an anti-aircraft weapon, the famous 88, with a muzzle velocity of 2,536 feet per second. It could drive the armor-piercing shell 39 through 4.7 inches of steel at 1,000 meters. No Soviet tank of that time could withstand it. Staudegger served in the 13th Heavy Panzer Company of the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. He was 20 years old, born on February 12, 1923, in Nussdorf am Attersee, Austria. The son of a simple farmer who had volunteered for the Waffen-SS in 1941. Young, but already experienced, he had survived the battles for Kharkov, the brutal winter battles that turned men into veterans, or corpses, in hours. Staudegger was no ordinary tank commander. His superiors described him as unusually calm under fire, with an almost uncanny sense of the battlefield. At Kharkov in March 1943, he had already destroyed 2 T-34s and stopped a Soviet counterattack. The award of the Iron Cross Second Class followed promptly. He had assembled his crew himself. Herbert Stahlmacher, the driver, came from Saxony and had been a mechanic by trade. He knew engines better than his own face. Gerhard Waltersdorf, the radio operator, was the oldest of the group at 28, a quiet man from Bavaria who spoke 4 languages. Heinz Buchner, the gunner, was known for his deadly precision, a former hunter from the Alps whose eyes did not tire even after hours of aiming. Walter Henke, the loader, was the youngest, just 19, but strong as a bear and as fast as a machine when loading the heavy 88 shells. On the morning of July 7th, Staudegger's Tiger took a hit that damaged its track. Not enough to destroy the vehicle, but enough to immobilize it. His company commander ordered a retreat. Staudegger was to wait for repairs while the others moved on. He remained behind with 4 men. Herbert Stahlmacher at the wheel, Gerhard Woltersdorf at the radio, Heinz Buchner as gunner, Walter Henker as loader, 5 men in 57 tons of steel, alone on the battlefield. The first hours were quiet. Staudegger's crew worked feverishly on the track. They knew they were vulnerable. A single Tiger, motionless, was a target that even the worst enemy could not miss. The temperature inside the Tiger rose to over 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The July sun burned on the metal, turning the fighting compartment into an oven. Sweat ran down the men's faces, dripping onto the ammunition crates, the instruments, the oil-stained hands that worked on the chain. Stahlmacher, the driver, was the one leading the repair. He knew every inch of the Tiger, every weakness, every peculiarity. He had driven the vehicle since its delivery, through the mud fields of the Russian spring, through the dust clouds of summer. The Tiger was not just a machine to him. It was a comrade made of steel. The damaged track had 3 broken links. Normally, such a repair would have taken hours, with the right tools, with spare parts, with peace and quiet. Stahlmacher had none of that. He improvised, using wire and raw metal, hammering and welding under the scorching sun. Then came the message over the radio. A Soviet tank column was approaching from the northeast. At least 50 vehicles, T-34s, the workhorses of the Red Army. They would reach Staudegger's position in less than an hour. The T-34 was not a bad tank. On the contrary, when it first appeared in 1940, it had shocked the German army. Sloped armor that made projectiles ricochet, a 76mm gun that could penetrate most German tanks, a wide track that carried it through mud and snow where German tanks got stuck. But by 1943, the T-34 was no longer so superior. The Germans had learned. They had developed the Tiger, then the Panther. The 76mm gun of the T-34 could not penetrate a Tiger frontally, except at very short range. The Soviet tank crews knew this. They called the Tiger the Grim Reaper. The column approaching Staudegger belonged to the 10th Soviet Tank Corps under General Major Vasily Burkov. Burkov was an experienced commander who had fought at Stalingrad. He had received orders to halt the German advance in his sector. His reconnaissance had informed him a lone German tank. Immobile, without support, an easy target, Vasily Burkov dispatched 50 of his best T-34s, more than enough to overwhelm a single enemy. What he didn't know was this enemy was a Tiger tank, and its commander was Franz Staudegger. But here's what separated Staudegger from the rest. Another commander might have surrendered, might have ordered the crew to abandon the vehicle, detonate the ammunition, and make their own way out. That would have been the sensible decision. Staudegger made a different decision. He ordered his men to accelerate the repairs, not to flee, but to fight. Over the next 40 minutes, the crew managed to patch up the track provisionally. The Tiger could move again, albeit slowly and with limitations. Sharp turns were impossible, but forward and backward it could manage. Staudegger positioned his Tiger in a shallow depression, providing cover against flanking attacks. Then he waited. The first T-34s appeared at 2:10 p.m. They advanced in a wide formation, confident in their numerical superiority, 50 against 1. The odds were clear. What they didn't know, the Tiger had 2 crucial advantages. First, the 88mm KWK-36 cannon. This gun could penetrate a T-34 at over 1,500 meters. The T-34's 76mm gun could only penetrate a Tiger frontally at under 500 meters, if at all. Second, the armor, 100mm at the front, 80mm on the sides, for the Soviet cannons. This was an almost impenetrable barrier. At 2:17 p.m., Staudegger fired the first shot, range 1,200 meters. The lead T-34 exploded. The ammunition inside detonated. tearing off the turret, hurling it 30 feet into the air. A fireball soared into the sky. The other T-34s braked, surprised. They had expected to roll over an immobile wreck. Instead, they were facing an enemy that fired with precision and landed every shot. The second shot followed 8 seconds later. Another hit, another explosion. The third T-34 tried to evade, turning sharply to the left. Staudegger adjusted. Buchner at the gun tracked the target with the calm of a watchmaker. The third shot pierced the engine compartment. Flames erupted. What followed was less a battle than a systematic annihilation. The T-34s fired as they approached. Their shells struck the Tiger, bounced off, leaving dents and scratches in the armor. Buchner, the gunner, calmly targeted one enemy after another. Henke loaded again and again. Staudegger called out the targets, directed the fire, kept track of everything. The 5th T-34 was burning, then the 8th, the 10th. The Soviet commanders radioed desperate messages back to Major General Vasily Burkov. The single German tank is firing with incredible precision. We're losing vehicles. It's not immobile, it's fighting back. Burkov ordered his men to continue. Overwhelm it with mass. No one can withstand against 50 tanks, but Staudegger did withstand, shot after shot, hit after hit. The wrecks of the T-34s increasingly blocked the battlefield, forcing those following to make detours, exposing their flanks. Each destroyed tank became an obstacle for the others, a domino effect of death. Inside the Tiger, there was concentrated chaos. Buchner at the gun moved the heavy turret with calm precision. The electric turret drive hummed with each movement. Henke at the loading bay grabbed shell after shell from the racks, shoved them into the breech, locked the bolt. A well-oiled team, functioning like a finely tuned machine. Staudegger stood in the turret, his upper body projecting from the hatch, despite the danger. He needed the overview. He saw the T-34s coming, saw their formations, recognized their intentions. Then he ducked down, shouted the next coordinates, and Buchner swung the turret. The Tiger fired every 8 to 10 seconds. One shell, one hit, one burning T-34. This was not heroism. This was craftsmanship, deadly, precise craftsmanship, born from months of practice and years of experience. The Soviet commanders began to realize they were facing a monster. They tried to outflank the Tiger, to attack its sides. But Staudegger had chosen his position well. The depression protected his sides. The T-34s had to attack frontally or retreat. They attacked frontally. Current status, 500 subscribers, 16,000 hours of viewing time. If you want to watch regularly, subscribe now. Every subscription counts. Back to the story. By 3:30 p.m., just over an hour after the engagement began, Staudegger had destroyed 17 T-34s. His Tiger had absorbed an estimated 40 hits by then. The armor was holding, but ammunition was running low. Henke reported only 15 armor-piercing shells remaining. 15 shells, over 30 enemy tanks still on the field. The mathematics were lethal. Staudegger made another decision that cemented his reputation. He ordered Buchner to switch to high-explosive shells, high-explosive ammunition, actually intended for infantry and light targets, normally useless against tanks. But Staudegger had been observing. The T-34s had thinner armor on the sides and rear. If he hit them in those areas, maybe with enough force to destroy the running gear or damage the engine, it was a risk. But what alternative did he have? The first high-explosive hit struck the side of a T-34. The tank lost its track, spinning helplessly in circles. The second hit pierced the rear armor of another T-34, striking the engine compartment. Flames shot from the rear. It was working. Not as elegant as armor-piercing ammunition, but it was working. By 4:45 p.m., Staudegger had disabled 5 more T-34s. 22 Soviet tanks were burning or lying immobile on the battlefield. His Tiger had now absorbed 67 hits. The armor was dented, scratched, in some places dangerously thin, but it was holding. The surviving T-34s began to retreat, first individually, then in groups. The panic was palpable. They had expected to roll over a helpless enemy. Instead, they had lost a third of their strength against a single opponent. Staudegger let them go. He had no ammunition left for a pursuit, and his Tiger was at its end. The provisional repair of the track had held, but only just. Any further movement risked complete failure. As night fell across the battlefield, Staudegger sat exhausted on the turret of his Tiger. 22 burning wrecks, 67 hits on his armor, and no casualties among his crew. The silence after the battle was deafening. For hours, the noise had been unrelenting. The thunder of the cannon, the whistling of incoming shells, the crackle of exploding ammunition. Now, it was still. Only the crackling of the burning hulks could be heard, the hissing of leaking oil, the groaning of hot metal. The smell was overwhelming. Burned rubber, melted metal, gunpowder. And beneath that, something else, something none of the men wanted to name. The smell of burned flesh, wafting from the T-34s, the Soviet crews, who hadn't been able to escape in time. Staudegger stared out at the battlefield. He was 20 years old. He had just killed over 60 men. Maybe more. Men just like him, who had followed orders, who had fought for their country, who had families at home, waiting for them. He felt nothing, only exhaustion. A deep, bottomless exhaustion that reached into his very bones. The men climbed out of the Tiger, one by one. Their uniforms were soaked with sweat, their faces black with gunpowder. Hank, the loader, had bloody hands from the constant work with the heavy shells. Booker massaged his shoulders, cramped from hours of aiming. Waltersdorf, on the radio, had a headache from the incessant noise of the impacts, but they were alive, all 5 of them. In a war where tank crews were often completely annihilated, it was a miracle of steel, gunpowders, and human will. Steel inspected his Tiger. The armor was covered in dents and scratches. In at least 6 places, the metal had become dangerously thin. A single further hit in the right spot could have penetrated. They had been lucky, enormously lucky. News of his victory spread quickly. A single Tiger against 50 T-34s, 22 kills. The first time a Tiger commander had destroyed so many enemies in a single engagement. High Command took notice. The news reached the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler headquarters that very night. From there it went on to the SS Führungshauptamt in Berlin, and finally to the Führerhauptquartier Wolfschanze in East Prussia. The propaganda department was thrilled. A single Tiger against 50 enemies, 22 kills. This was exactly the kind of story the regime needed. Operation Citadel had stalled. Losses were higher than expected. The breakthrough hadn't happened, but here was a hero, a young Austrian, who had proven that German technology and German courage could defeat any enemy. On July 10th, 1943, Franz Staudegger received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. He was the first Tiger commander to be awarded this honor. The award came unusually quickly, just 3 days after the battle. Normally the process took weeks, sometimes months. But this case was special. This case was perfect for propaganda. The presentation took place only 3 days after the battle, unusually fast for such a high decoration. Staudegger was ordered to the Führerhauptquartier to report on the battle to Adolf Hitler personally. The 20-year-old Austrian stood before the dictator and spoke of 22 burning T-34s, of 67 hits, of 5 men against an army. Hitler was fascinated. The Tiger was his favorite tank, a symbol of German technological superiority. Staudegger's story fit perfectly into the propaganda. A single Aryan against the Slavic tide. The newspapers printed the story on the front pages. The young tank commander was stylized as a hero. What the propaganda omitted, Staudegger and his men had survived because they had been lucky. The Soviet gunners had aimed poorly. The shells had hit at unfavorable angles. The armor had held through a combination of engineering and pure chance. But the story also has a darker side, one that is often overlooked. After the war, Soviet records became accessible. They told a somewhat different story. Soviet losses were high, yes, but the exact number of tanks destroyed by Staudegger is disputed. Some historians speak of 17, others of 22. Still others doubt the numbers altogether. What is not disputed? Staudegger and his crew stood their ground against overwhelming odds. They prevented the breakthrough of the 10th Soviet Tank Corps in their sector. They bought time for the German reserves to form. The myth of the invincible Tiger was born that day, and like all myths, it contained truth and exaggeration. The truth, the Tiger I was, in 1943, actually the best tank on the battlefield. Its combination of firepower and armor made it virtually invulnerable in frontal engagements. The exaggeration, a single Tiger could not win battles. The German army produced only 354 Tigers during the entire war. The Soviets built over 50,000 T-34s. The numbers were clear. Staudegger himself survived the war. He later fought under Michael Wittmann in the 101st Heavy SS Panzer Battalion and was involved in the fighting in Normandy and the Ardennes. After the war, he lived in seclusion in Austria and rarely spoke about his experiences. He died on March 16, 1991, at the age of 68. In his obituary, there was no mention of 22 T-34s or 67 hits. Only Franz Staudegger, farmer, died peacefully at home. His crew members also survived the war, at least most of them. Herbert Steele, the driver, was wounded in action in Normandy in 1944, but survived. Heinz Bucher, the gunner with the deadly precision, fell in December 1944 in the Ardennes. Walter Hank and Gerhard Waltersdorf returned to their hometowns after the war ended. They never met again. The 5 men who had defeated death together in a steel coffin went their separate ways. Staudegger never spoke about them. When historians interviewed him in the 1980s, he refused to reveal details. It was too painful, too complex, too intertwined with everything he wanted to forget. What remains are the sober facts in the archives, the reports, the numbers, the data, and the question that everyone must ask themselves when they hear this story. What does heroism mean when it happens in the service of a criminal ideology? But in the archives, the story lives on. The reports, the maps, the eyewitness accounts, they tell the story of a day in July 1943 when a 20-year-old Austrian decided he would not give up. He repaired his damaged machine, chose his position, and waited. He fired and fired and fired until the enemies fled in panic. The Soviet generals had laughed when they saw the lone Tiger. They weren't laughing anymore when they counted their losses. To be perfectly honest, the channel needs 1,000 subscribers to keep growing. Currently, we're at 500. If you're enjoying this detailed historical work, please subscribe now. Every subscription brings us closer to more archival research and deeper documentaries. What can we learn from this story? Not the myth of German superiority, because Germany lost the war, not the glorification of violence. because every burning tank meant dead men on both sides. What remains is something simpler, something profoundly human, the story of a man who refused to give up when the odds were stacked against him, who made the most of the resources he had available, who thought clearly and acted decisively in a moment of extreme danger. Staudegger's crew trusted him implicitly, steelmaker at the controls, precisely positioning the Tiger, despite the damaged track, Waltersdorf on the radio, monitoring the situation and calling for reinforcements, Buchner at the gun. His accuracy a matter of life and death, Henke at the loader, his speed making all the difference, 5 men in a steel coffin. That's the reality of tank warfare. No glamour, no heroics in the style of old chivalric romances, just heat, noise, the stench of gunpowder and burnt metal, and the constant fear that the next shell might penetrate. 67 hits, each one a moment of terror, the thunder of impact, the shaking of the turret. The waiting for the pain, that would have meant the armor had failed, but it didn't fail, not on that day. The Tiger's 88mm gun was a technical masterpiece, originally developed as an anti-aircraft weapon. It had proven deadly effective against tanks. The muzzle velocity of 773 meters per second propelled armor-piercing shells through almost any armor of the era. For the Soviet T-34s, it was a death sentence. But technology alone doesn't explain everything. The Wehrmacht had better training, better tactics, better leadership at the unit level. Every German tank was equipped with radios, enabling coordination in combat. The Soviet tanks often had only flag signals. In the chaos of battle, that made an enormous difference. Staudegger exploited these advantages to the max. He positioned his Tiger where the enemies could only attack frontally. He directed his fire at the most dangerous targets first. He switched from armor-piercing to high-explosive ammunition as the situation demanded. Adaptability in the moment of crisis. The Soviet tank commanders, on the other hand, attacked according to a formula. Mass instead of tactics. Forward, always forward, until the enemy was overrun. This doctrine had worked against weaker opponents, against a single, well-positioned Tiger. It was a death sentence. After Kursk, the Red Army analyzed its defeat. The lessons were bitter. The T-34 needed a stronger gun to fight Tigers head-on. Thus, the T-34-85 was born. With its 85mm gun, it needed better communication. So more tanks got radios. It needed better tactics, so the commanders were trained more intensively. Staudegger's victory, ironically, contributed to the improvement of Soviet tank warfare. A Pyrrhic victory, in the strategic sense. The Wehrmacht won the battle, but the Soviets won the war. These aren't just statistics from dusty archives. These are the moments that decided the fate of millions. Real soldiers, real fear, real consequences. These stories must never be forgotten. If these historical truths matter to you, then support the channel with YouTube's Super Thanks, the golden heart below. Every Super Thanks allows me to spend weeks in archives, digitizing rare documents, interviewing last living witnesses in the Kubinka Tank Museum in Russia. A Tiger I still stands, captured, restored, exhibited. Visitors look at its massive silhouette, its thick armor, the long gun. They see a machine, but behind every machine stood men. The vehicle in Kubinka is one of only 6 surviving Tiger I tanks worldwide. There's one in the Bovington Tank Museum in England, one in the Musée des Blindés in France, one in the Panzer Museum Munster in Germany, and fragments in other collections. Of the Ulan 354 Tigers that were built, only these few survived the war. The others were destroyed, blown up, scrapped, or sank into the battlefields of Europe and Russia. The Tiger in Kubinka was captured in January 1943, 6 months before Staudegger's engagement. The Soviet engineers disassembled it down to the last screw, analyzed every weld, every alloy, every system. They looked for weaknesses, and they found them. The reports helped to develop the next generation of Soviet tanks that would eventually outmatch the Tigers. The vehicle in Kubinka was captured in January 1943 near Leningrad. When a Tiger got stuck in a swamp and was abandoned by its crew, the Soviets pulled it out, examined it meticulously, looking for vulnerabilities. They found some. The side armor was more vulnerable than the front. The tracks tended to come off during sharp turns. The engine consumed enormous amounts of fuel, but they also found strengths that scared them. The build quality, the precise welds, the sophisticated optics. The Tiger was not just a tank. It was a masterpiece of German engineering, and at Kursk it would show what it was capable of. In the days after Staudegger's engagement, Soviet officers flocked to the battlefield to examine the wreckage. They counted the bullet holes in the T-34s, measured the angles, analyzed the penetrations. Their reports were sobering. The 88mm shells had torn through the Soviet armor like paper, even at long range, even at unfavorable angles. The lesson was clear. The T-34 desperately needed an upgrade. Within a year, the T-34-85 would go into production with an 85mm gun that finally offered a chance against the Tiger. Staudegger's victory, paradoxically, had contributed to the modernization of his most dangerous enemy. Men like Franz Staudegger, who fought and survived the hell of Kursk. Men like the Soviet T-34 crews, who faced overwhelming odds and died. They were all sons, brothers, fathers. They all had families waiting for their return. 22 Soviet tanks burned on that July day. That means between 66 and 110 dead men on the Soviet side. Depending on how many managed to escape, 110 families in the Soviet Union later received the news. Your son has fallen for the fatherland. That is the true story of Kursk. Not heroes and villains, but people, trapped in a machinery of death that none of them had chosen. Staudegger was no monster. He was a 20-year-old soldier who did what he had to do to survive. The Soviet tank drivers were not subhuman. They were young men, fighting for their countries against an enemy that sought to annihilate them. The story of the lone Tiger against 50 T-34s is impressive, but it should not blind us. Behind the numbers are people, behind the victories are losses. Behind the myth lies a reality that is more complex and tragic than any hero's tale can tell. 67 hits, 22 kills, a Knight's Cross. These are the facts. What remains is the question. What would we have done in Staudegger's place, in the place of the Soviet commanders, in the place of the men, in the burning T-34s? There are no easy answers, only the memory and the responsibility to preserve that memory so that something like this never happens again. On that July day in 1943, the Soviet generals laughed when they saw the lone Tiger, a damaged tank, alone, without support. They sent 50 T-34s to overrun it. It should have been an easy victory. They were not laughing when they counted their losses. 22 T-34s, between 66 and 110 dead men, an entire battalion, decimated by a single opponent. The story of Franz Staudegger is not a hero's tale in the classical sense. It is a story about the absurdity of war, about people who were forced to kill each other, about technology that transformed people into monsters. But it is also a story about the human will, about the refusal to give up, about the impossible that became possible. 67 hits, 22 kills, a single tiger against 50 enemies, the first Knight's Cross. For a tiger commander, the story sounds like a legend, but it is true, documented in German and Soviet archives, witnessed by survivors on both sides. The Soviet generals laughed at the lone tiger until he destroyed 22 of their T-34s. Then they were not laughing anymore.